Please buy me, I will do anything, begs the obese girl, the mountain man at auction, and the whole town laughed. But they didn't know she carried a secret tied to every drop of water for miles. On the dusty block, sold for a single silver dollar, a forgotten girl became the spark of something bigger than anyone saw coming. He's a man who lost everything, except his code. She's the daughter of a Yaqui woman who died with a map in her heart, and a deed no railroad man once found. Now they ride into the hills, hunted by lawmen, tracked by greed, bound by a promise buried in stone. The land don't forget, and neither will the men who want her gone. When the church bell rings and rifles rise, one question cuts through the noise like thunder. Will the girl they mocked become the one who saves them all? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Granite Gulch's auction yard, turning the packed dirt into a shimmer of dust and heat waves. The crowd pressed close, their laughter cruel, as they watched 16-year-old Rosie May stand trembling on the wooden platform. Her father, reeking of cheap whiskey, circled her like a vulture. "Step right up, folks," he bellowed, swaying slightly. "Got me a girl here, big as a house. Might not be much to look at, but she can cook and clean." He grabbed Rosie's arm roughly, making her flinch. Rosie's cheeks burned with shame as tears traced silent paths down her round face. Her simple cotton dress was faded but clean, her dark hair neatly braided, small dignities she clung to despite everything. The townsfolk's mockery cut deep, but she held herself as straight as she could, just as her mother had taught her. At the edge of the crowd, Elias Boone's weathered face darkened with each passing moment. His massive frame, wrapped in a buckskin coat despite the heat, stood motionless as stone. But his eyes, sharp as a hawk's, missed nothing. The girl's quiet dignity in the face of such cruelty stirred something deep within him. Memories of another brave soul lost to frontier brutality. Rosie's gaze found his, and her whispered plea carried across the sudden hush. "Please buy me, sir. I will do anything." Her voice cracked, but her eyes held steady, revealing a strength that belied her youth. Without a word, Elias strode forward. His heavy boots kicked up dust with each deliberate step. The crowd parted before him like water, their laughter dying in their throats. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a single silver dollar, its surface worn smooth from years of carry. $1, he announced, his voice as rough as mountain granite. The coin gleamed as he held it up, catching the merciless sun. The crowd fell silent, shocked by this turn of events. Rosie's father gaped, his bleary eyes struggling to focus on the coin. Before he could protest, Elias pressed the dollar into his palm and turned to Rosie, his expression softening slightly. "Come along, girl," he said quietly, offering his calloused hand to help her down from the platform. Rosie took it hesitantly, her smaller hand disappearing into his giant grip. As she stepped down, someone in the crowd snickered. Elias's head snapped around, his glare silencing any further mockery. He guided Rosie through the parting crowd, his broad shoulders shielding her from their stares. They walked in silence toward the livery stable, where Elias's pack mule waited. The animal's ears twitched forward at their approach, recognizing its master. Before they could reach the stable, a sharp voice cut through the air. "Now hold on there, Boone." Deputy Silas Renshaw stepped out from the shadow of the stable door, his tin star catching the light. A smirk played across his thin lips as he adjusted his gun belt. "Seems to me there might be some legal obligations to consider," Renshaw drawled, his eyes sliding from Elias to Rosie and back again. "Girl's got some debts to settle, way I hear it." Elias positioned himself between Rosie and the deputy, his massive frame casting a protective shadow. "Only obligation here is yours, Renshaw. To uphold the law, not twist it." The deputy's smirk faltered slightly at Elias's tone, but he pressed on. "Railroads got interests to protect. Might need to review this Transaction. His hand rested casually on his holstered pistol. Transaction's done, Elias replied flatly. He felt Rosie trembling behind him but sensed her straightening her spine, gathering her courage. The same quiet strength he'd noticed earlier showed itself again. Renshaw opened his mouth to argue further, but something in Elias's steady gaze made him reconsider. The deputy's eyes narrowed, and his smirk returned. "We'll see about that," he said, touching the brim of his hat in mock politeness before turning away. As Renshaw's boot steps faded, Elias turned to Rosie. She stood clutching her worn shawl, but her chin was lifted, her dark eyes meeting his without flinching. In that moment, Elias recognized the same fire he'd once seen in his Cherokee wife's eyes, a determination that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. "Thank you," Rosie whispered, her voice steady despite everything she'd endured. Elias nodded once, his expression grave. "Let's get you home, girl." He turned toward the stable, his instincts warning him that Renshaw's threats were far from empty. But for now, the silver dollar had bought them time, and sometimes on the frontier, time was all the advantage you needed. Inside the dim livery stable, dust motes danced in shafts of late afternoon sunlight. The familiar scents of hay, leather, and horse filled the air as Elias methodically prepared his mule for travel. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking each buckle and strap of the saddle. Rosie May stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly together. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to thank you proper for what you did out there." Elias paused in his work, turning to face her. The girl's eyes were still red from crying, but she held herself with quiet dignity. "Listen here, girl," he said, his gruff voice gentler than before. "What happened out there wasn't right. No person should be sold like cattle." He adjusted the mule's bridle, giving himself a moment to choose his next words carefully. "You're not my servant, understand? And you don't belong to anybody now." Rosie's eyes widened slightly, hope and disbelief warring across her features. "But sir, surely you expect—" "What I expect," Elias cut in firmly, "is for you to hold your head high and remember you're a free person." He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a spare blanket. "Here, evening's coming on, and it gets cold up in the hills." Before Rosie could respond, boot heels clicked against the wooden floor of the stable. Deputy Renshaw's lean figure appeared in the doorway, backlit by the setting sun. Behind him stood a well-dressed man in an expensive suit, his watch chain glinting gold in the fading light. "Mr. Boone," the suited man said smoothly, stepping forward. "Lucius Coyle, railroad agent. I'm afraid we have a situation that requires immediate attention." His polished boots barely stirred the dust as he walked, like a cat stalking its prey. Elias positioned himself between the men and Rosie, his broad shoulders filling the narrow stable aisle. "Ain't no situation here except me and the girl heading home." Coyle's smile never reached his eyes. On the contrary, the young lady's father has outstanding debts to certain interests I represent. She's considered collateral for those obligations. "Gambling debts ain't legal claims," Elias growled. "Perhaps not," Coyle conceded, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. "But there's also the matter of her mother's land claim. Fascinating document, really. Seems it's rather crucial for our planned water expansion." His eyes fixed on Rosie. "Your mother was quite clever with her paperwork, wasn't she, my dear?" Rosie's sharp intake of breath told Elias everything he needed to know. This wasn't about gambling debts or today's spectacle. It was about water rights and railroad greed. He'd seen it before. Powerful men using any excuse to steal what they wanted. Elias kept his face carefully neutral, though his hands tightened on the mule's reins. "Reckon we ought to sort this out proper-like tomorrow," he said, forcing his voice to sound agreeable. "Girls had a hard day. We'll come by the sheriff's office first thing." Deputy Renshaw's hand drifted to his gun belt, but Coyle raised a staying hand. "Of course, Mr. Boone." We're all reasonable men here." His smile widened fractionally. "Though I should mention, any documentation the girl might have regarding her mother's claim would be of particular interest. For sorting things out properly, you understand?" "Much obliged for your patience," Elias replied evenly, though his stomach churned at the implied threat. The sun had dipped below the horizon by the time Elias helped Rosie mount the mule. Rather than take the main street, he led them through the shadowy maze of back alleys behind the livery. The mule's hooves were muffled in the soft dirt as they wound their way past storage sheds and empty corrals. Rosie sat straight in the saddle, the borrowed blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "They know about Mama's papers," she whispered, her voice tight with worry. "Hush now," Elias murmured, guiding them around another corner. He'd spotted movement at the end of the street, men on horseback, waiting in the gathering darkness. "We'll talk when we're clear of town." They took another turn, then another, working their way toward the edge of town through the deepening twilight. Elias's keen eyes caught glimpses of more of Renshaw's men, but his roundabout route kept them one step ahead. The deputy's search pattern showed he expected them to take the main road north. When they finally cleared the last buildings, Elias led them into a shallow wash, where the mule's tracks would be harder to follow. The first stars were appearing in the purple sky, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage from the hills beyond. Only then did Elias allow himself to breathe more easily, though he knew their troubles were far from over. Dawn painted the eastern sky in soft rose and gold as Elias guided his mule along a narrow trail winding into the highlands. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and mountain sage. Behind them, Granite Gulch had shrunk to a cluster of tiny buildings, nestled in the valley below. Rosie May gripped the saddle horn tightly, her knuckles white with effort. Every few steps, she would sway slightly, then straighten herself with determined dignity. The mule picked its way carefully over the rocky path, but each stumble made her tense. "You're doing fine," Elias said, noticing her struggle. "Old Jake here's sure-footed as they come." "I ain't never rode this long before," Rosie admitted quietly, "but I can manage." Elias nodded, respecting her resolve. The girl hadn't uttered a single complaint, though he knew she must be sore and tired. They continued upward as the sun climbed higher, stopping occasionally to let the mule rest and drink from clear mountain streams. By nightfall, they had reached a sheltered creek bed lined with cottonwoods. Elias helped Rosie down from the saddle, steadying her as her legs trembled from the long day's ride. He quickly set about making camp, showing her how to gather dry kindling while he laid a small fire. "Ain't much," he said, pulling cornbread and dried beef from his saddlebags, "but it'll keep body and soul together." They sat beside the crackling fire, the creek's gentle murmur mixing with the evening songs of crickets. Rosie wrapped her borrowed blanket tighter around her shoulders, staring into the flames. "My mama," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear. "She used to tell me stories at night about our people, the Yaqui, and about the land." She glanced at Elias, then back to the fire. "She said there was papers, important ones, hidden away in the old chapel ruins. A deed," she whispered, "that would protect our water rights forever." Elias's hands stilled in their work of banking the fire. "That's why the railroad man was so interested," he said thoughtfully. "Water rights are worth more than gold out here." Rosie nodded. "Mama said we had to keep it secret. That bad men would try to take it if they knew." Her voice caught. "She died before she could show me exactly where, but I remember everything she told me about that place." "Your mama was a wise woman," Elias said quietly, fighting them railroad men with paper instead of guns. He studied Rosie's face in the firelight, seeing the same quiet strength her mother must have possessed. They rose before dawn the next morning, continuing their journey as the sky brightened. By mid-morning, they crested a ridge, and Elias pointed ahead. "There it is, home, such as it is." His line shack stood in a small clearing, a modest cabin built of rough-hewn logs. Pine trees surrounded it on three sides, offering shelter from the wind, while the front faced east to catch the morning sun. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, the banked fire from his last stay still holding life. Elias led Rosie inside, where simple furnishings spoke of a solitary life. A plank table, 2 chairs, a cast iron stove, and 2 narrow bunks built into the walls. "This here's yours now," he said, gesturing to the lower bunk. "Got fresh straw in the tick, and the blankets are clean." He watched as Rosie ran her hand over the rough wool blanket, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she whispered. "I ain't had my own bed since Mama passed." Elias cleared his throat, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Well, best we get to work. Wood pile's running low." Outside, he showed Rosie to the chopping block, demonstrating how to stand, how to grip the axe handle properly. "Keep your feet apart, like so," he instructed, "and never force the swing. Let the weight of the axe head do the work." Rosie watched intently, then tried herself. Her first few swings were awkward, but she learned quickly, splitting smaller pieces while Elias tackled the larger logs. They worked together through the morning, the steady thunk of axe against wood echoing through the trees. "You're a natural," Elias said, watching her set another split log on the growing pile. The praise brought a flush of pride to Rosie's cheeks, and she stood straighter, wielding the axe with growing confidence. As they worked, a jay called from the pines, and a cool breeze carried the promise of rain. Elias glanced at the sky, then at Rosie, seeing not the scared girl from yesterday's auction block, but a young woman finding her strength, one swing of the axe at a time. The morning sun had barely cleared the pines when Rosie May rose from her bunk, determined to prove herself useful. She watched Elias checking his rifle by the window, his weathered hands moving with practiced care. Without a word, she grabbed the empty water buckets near the door. "I can fetch water," she said firmly, though her voice quavered slightly. "Done it plenty back home." Elias looked up, studying her face. "Creeks down the path behind the cabin. Mind the slick rocks?" Rosie nodded, stepping out into the cool mountain air. The path wound between tall pines, their needles cushioning her steps. At the creek, she filled the buckets carefully, the clear water so different from the muddy wells of Granite Gulch. The weight pulled at her arms on the return journey, but she refused to stop or spill a drop. Back inside, she found Elias nailing extra boards across the window frames. Searching for another way to help, she spotted torn blankets folded in a corner. Threading a needle from her pocket, one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep, she settled onto her bunk and began mending the worn wool with tiny, careful stitches. Through the afternoon, Elias worked methodically, reinforcing doors and checking sight lines through the windows. Rosie moved quietly around him, hauling more water, sweeping the rough plank floor, and continuing her mending. The cabin slowly transformed under their shared efforts, becoming more secure, more orderly, more like a home. As evening approached, Rosie stirred a pot of beans on the stove, while Elias sliced cornbread. The familiar tasks brought back memories of cooking for her father, of his cruel words about her appetite. She set down her spoon, her throat tight. "I know I eat more than I should," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Papa always said I was nothing but a burden, eating up profits that could have gone to whiskey." She stared at her hands, twisted in her apron. "I'll try to eat less here, Mr. Boone. I don't want to be a burden to you, too." Elias set down his knife with deliberate care. "Look at me, girl." Rosie raised her eyes slowly, bracing for judgment. "You're carrying more than you ought to," he said gruffly. "But it ain't pounds I'm talking about." He gestured to her shoulders, bent under invisible weight. "You're carrying shame that ain't yours to bear, and fear that was forced on you. Those are the burdens we need to set down." Tears welled in Rosie's eyes, but she straightened her shoulders slightly, as if testing how it felt to let go of a fraction of that weight. The next morning, dew still sparkled on the grass when Elias led Rosie into the forest. First lesson in tracking, he said, pointing to tiny marks in the soft earth. Rabbit passed through here, not more than an hour ago. Rosie knelt carefully, studying the delicate impressions. These 2 marks here, are those the back feet? Elias nodded approvingly. Good eye. See how they're set wider? Rabbit pushes off with those, leaves a deeper print. He moved forward, pointing out more signs. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, droppings that told stories of the forest's smaller residents. Through the morning, they followed various trails, Elias teaching and Rosie absorbing every detail. She showed a natural patience, waiting quietly as chipmunks grew bold enough to gather seeds nearby. Her face lit up when she spotted signs before Elias pointed them out, each small success building her confidence. They were heading back to the cabin when hoofbeats approached. Elias pushed Rosie behind a broad pine trunk, his hand going to his rifle. But the rider who appeared was Mrs. Hester Kincaid, her gray hair neat under her hat, despite the early hour. Elias Boone, she called softly, reining her horse to a stop. Thought I might find you up here. Her kind eyes found Rosie, who had stepped out from behind the tree. And Miss Rosie May, good to see you safe. What brings you up the mountain, Hester? Elias asked, though his stance remained watchful. Mrs. Kincaid's face grew serious. Deputy Renshaw's been asking questions down in town. Him and his railroad friends were seen yesterday, poking around those old Indian chapel ruins east of the creek. She looked meaningfully at Rosie. Seems they're mighty interested in what might be hidden there. Rosie's hand flew to her throat, where her mother's teachings lay stored in memory. Elias stepped closer to her, his presence steady and reassuring. Much obliged for the warning, he said to Mrs. Kincaid. Any other news we should know? Just that you've got friends in the valley, Mrs. Kincaid replied firmly. More than that deputy might guess. She gathered her reins. I'll keep my ears open and send word if anything changes. They watched her ride away, the morning sun casting long shadows through the trees. Rosie stood straighter beside Elias, her mother's secret and Mrs. Kincaid's friendship wrapping around her like a warm shawl, helping to lift those burdens she'd carried for so long. Dawn mist still clung to the valley when Elias led Rosie from the cabin. They mounted carefully, Elias on his mule, Rosie on a borrowed horse from Mrs. Kincaid's stable. The morning air held a bite that made Rosie pull her shawl tighter. Chapel's half a day's ride, Elias said quietly, steering them away from the main trail. We'll take the high ground, keep to the timber. He guided them through a maze of pine stands and rocky outcrops, choosing paths that kept them hidden from the valleys below. The sun climbed higher as they wound through the hills. Elias chose each path with care, sometimes doubling back or wading in the shadows of large rocks to ensure they weren't followed. Rosie watched him read the land, noting how his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. Near midday, they paused in a sheltered grove to rest the horses. Rosie shared out cornbread and dried apple slices while Elias kept watch. The peaceful moment seemed to stir something in him. Had a wife once, he said suddenly, his voice rough with memory. Cherokee woman named Morning Star. Taught me more about this land than all my years of scouting. He adjusted his rifle strap, eyes distant. She showed me how her people viewed treaties, not just papers with marks, but sacred promises to the land itself. Rosie listened intently, recognizing the weight of trust in his sharing. Settlers didn't see it that way? She asked softly. Elias's face hardened. To most, treaties were just words to be broken when convenient. Railroads no different. They see paper claims as things to tear up or buy off. He looked at Rosie directly. Your mama knew that. Must be why she hid that deed so careful. They rode on through the afternoon, climbing higher into the hills. The chapel's location slowly revealed itself. A stone structure nestled in a distant valley, its walls weathered but still standing. Elias led them to a ridge overlooking the site where dense pines provided cover. As the sun began its descent, Elias dismounted and motioned Rosie to join him. They crouched behind a fallen log. The valley spread before them. The chapel stood silent below, its empty windows dark against the pale stone. "Now," Elias whispered, "time to learn how to listen to these woods proper. Not for animals this time, for men." Rosie closed her eyes as Elias instructed, focusing her attention. The wind whispered through pine needles above. A jay called in the distance. But Elias taught her to listen deeper, for sounds that didn't belong. The crack of a branch breaking under a boot, metal clicking against metal, voices carried on the wind. The lesson proved timely. As darkness crept into the valley, a thin tendril of smoke rose from near the chapel walls. Elias touched Rosie's arm, pointing to the barely visible gray line against the darkening sky. "Railroad men," he murmured. "Posted scouts to watch the place." Rosie's heart quickened. They think Mama's deed is still hidden there. And they aim to find it. Elias surveyed the valley carefully. Count at least 3 campfires. Could be more men we can't see. They watched until full dark settled, noting the positions of the guards. When the moon rose, Elias led them carefully back through the woods, away from the chapel and its watchers. They made camp in a hidden hollow 2 miles distant, where thick brush concealed them from any passing riders. Elias built a tiny fire, shielded by rocks. Its small warmth was welcome in the mountain night. Above them, stars pierced the darkness like silver pins, their light casting faint shadows through the pine boughs. "What do we do now?" Rosie asked, wrapping her blanket tighter against the chill. "They'll tear that chapel apart looking for something that's not there." Elias poked the fire thoughtfully. "Maybe that's to our advantage. While they're busy searching there, we can work out where your mama really hid that deed." He looked at Rosie across the flames. "Think careful now. Did she ever mention any other places? Any special spots she'd visit?" Rosie closed her eyes, trying to recall her mother's words. The fire crackled softly as she searched her memories, while overhead, the stars wheeled in their ancient paths, keeping watch over their quiet planning. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, each lost in thought as their mounts picked their way through the shadowed forest. When they finally reached the familiar clearing, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the mountains. Inside, Rosie stoked the fire while Elias spread out a rough map on the table. His fingers traced the winding paths around the chapel, marking spots where he'd seen the railroad men's camps. "I reckon we could circle around from the north," he muttered, more to himself than to Rosie. "Less likely to have guards posted on the steep side." "I'm going with you," Rosie said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. Elias looked up sharply. "Too dangerous. These men ain't playing games." "Mama showed me things about that chapel." Rosie stepped closer to the table, her chin lifted. "Secret places only the women who cleaned it would know. I can find them in the dark." Elias studied her face for a long moment. The firelight caught the determination in her eyes, reminding him of Morningstar's quiet strength. "Your mama teach you to move quiet?" "Like a shadow in church," Rosie answered, a faint smile touching her lips. He nodded slowly. "All right then, but you follow my lead, no arguments." The next morning, they began their preparations. Elias taught Rosie how to wrap their horses' hooves in burlap to muffle their steps. They packed light, only what they could carry if they had to abandon the horses. Rosie carefully wrapped dried meat and hard biscuits, while Elias checked and rechecked his rifle. "Now for the false trail," Elias said, leading Rosie outside. The sun had climbed high, warming the pine needles and releasing their sharp scent. "We'll make it look like we're heading east toward the territorial line." He showed her how to break branches at shoulder height, scatter horse feet in clearings, and leave partial boot prints in soft earth. They worked their way in a wide arc, carefully crafting signs that would draw pursuers away from their true destination. "Folks see what they expect to see," he explained, deliberately scuffing a mark by a stream crossing. Railroad men expect us to run, so that's what these signs will tell them. Back at the cabin, Rosie practiced moving silently across the creaky floorboards while Elias cleaned his pistol. The afternoon light was fading when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Elias motioned Rosie to the back room and positioned himself by the door, rifle ready. "It's just me," Mrs. Kincaid's voice called out. "Bringing supper." Elias relaxed slightly, but still checked carefully before opening the door. Mrs. Kincaid stepped inside, carrying a cloth-wrapped bundle that filled the cabin with the smell of fresh bread. "Thought you could use some proper food," she said, setting the bundle on the table. Her face grew serious. "But that's not all I came to tell you." Rosie emerged from the back room as Mrs. Kincaid continued. Railroads posted notices all over town, offering $50 for information about Rosie's whereabouts. She shook her head grimly. That kind of money will loosen tongues. "Already seen their men at the chapel?" Elias said, accepting a piece of still warm bread. "We're moving tonight." Mrs. Kincaid's eyes widened. "Tonight? With all their men out there?" "That's why it needs to be tonight," Rosie spoke up. "They won't expect it." Mrs. Kincaid looked between them, then nodded slowly. "Lord watch over you both." She pressed a small package into Rosie's hands. "Extra bread, you'll need your strength." After Mrs. Kincaid left, they made final preparations in the deepening dusk. Elias checked their supplies one last time: rope, dark blankets, matches wrapped in oilcloth, and his weapons. Rosie changed into the darkest clothes she owned, her hands steady despite her racing heart. The moon rose full and bright as they led their horses from the cabin. Elias had chosen their mounts carefully, his sure-footed mule, and Mrs. Kincaid's quiet mare for Rosie. Both animals were dark-colored and trail-wise. "Remember," Elias said softly as they mounted up, "if anything goes wrong, you ride straight to Mrs. Kincaid's. Don't wait for me, don't look back, just ride." Rosie nodded, though they both knew she wouldn't leave him behind. The weight of her mother's brass cross felt warm against her chest, tucked safely under her shirt. Whatever happened tonight, she would face it with courage. They rode out under the moonlight, two shadows moving through the silver-touched forest. Behind them, the cabin disappeared into darkness. Ahead lay the chapel, its secrets, and whatever dangers awaited them in the night. The moonlight cast long shadows through the chapel's broken windows as Elias and Rosie crept forward through the tall grass. They had left their horses hidden in a dense thicket quarter-mile back, secured with loose reins in case they needed to flee quickly. The stone walls of the chapel rose before them, weathered and crumbling but still standing against the summer night sky. Elias held up one hand, motioning for Rosie to stop. They crouched in the shadows, listening. The gentle snoring of sleeping men drifted from behind the chapel where the railroad scouts had made their camp. A lone cricket chirped nearby, then fell silent. "3 men," Elias whispered, his breath barely stirring the air. 2 by the fire, 1 in a bedroll near the horses. Rosie nodded, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give them away. They waited, watching, until they were certain the men were deep in sleep. Then, moving like shadows themselves, they crept toward the chapel's broken door. The floorboards had long since rotted away, leaving only packed earth beneath their feet. Moonlight filtered through holes in the roof, painting silver patches on the ground. Rosie paused just inside, letting her eyes adjust to the deeper darkness. The familiar sense of dust and old wood brought back memories of kneeling beside her mother, watching her clean this sacred space. "Mama always said the old ways hide in plain sight," Rosie whispered, moving carefully toward the altar area. "The Spanish missionaries built their churches, but our people kept their secrets in the walls." Above a simple wooden cross, barely visible in the dim light, Rosie traced her fingers along the rough stone wall. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Count 3 stones down, 2 across. Feel for the one that sounds hollow." Her fingers found a loose stone, slightly smaller than the others. With trembling hands, she worked it free, revealing a small cavity behind it. Elias stood watch by the door, his rifle ready, as Rosie reached into the darkness. Her fingers touched paper, stiff and water-stained but intact. She pulled out a folded document, its edges brown with age. Even in the dim light, she could make out her mother's name written in careful script. The sudden crunch of boots on gravel outside froze them both. A man's voice carried through the broken window. "Gotta check the perimeter one more time, boss's orders." Elias gestured urgently toward the chapel's side wall, where part of the structure had collapsed years ago. Rosie tucked the deed into her shirt, close against her heart, and followed him. They squeezed through the narrow gap between fallen stones, just as lamplight spilled through the chapel's entrance. "Nothing here," the man called out, his boots scraping on stone. Elias and Rosie didn't wait to hear more. They moved swiftly through the darkness, staying low and using every shadow for cover. Behind them, a shout went up. They had been spotted. "There, by the wall!" The crack of a rifle shot split the night. Rosie felt the wind of its passage, but fear gave her speed she didn't know she possessed. They reached their horses as more shouts erupted behind them. Elias practically threw her onto Mrs. Kincaid's mare before swinging onto his mule. "Ride!" he commanded, and they plunged into the forest. Hoofbeats thundered behind them as their pursuers gave chase. Rosie clung to her horse's mane, trusting the mare to follow Elias's mule through the darkness. Branches whipped past her face. The deed pressed against her chest with each bounce of the horse's stride. The first fat drops of rain struck Rosie's face as they crashed through a stream. Thunder rolled overhead, and suddenly the sky opened up. The summer storm struck with full force, drumming against the leaves and turning the forest floor slick with mud. "This way!" Elias called over the storm's roar. He led them up a steep slope, where a rock outcropping created a natural shelter. They dismounted quickly, leading their animals underneath just as lightning split the sky. The rain fell in sheets now, obscuring visibility and washing away any tracks they might have left. They pressed back against the rock face, controlling their breathing as riders passed below. The men's curses were barely audible over the storm as they struggled to find any sign of their quarry's passage. "Lost 'em in this damned rain." "Keep searching. The boss will have our hides if they get away with that deed." Eventually, the sounds of horses and men faded, replaced by the steady drum of rain on leaves. Rosie's hands shook as she pulled out the deed, checking that it hadn't been damaged in their flight. Despite being damp from the rain, the document was still readable in the brief flashes of lightning. Elias kept watch, his rifle ready, but allowed himself a small smile at the sight of Rosie, clutching her mother's legacy. "You did good," he said softly. "Your mama would be proud." Rosie traced her fingers over her mother's name on the deed, feeling the weight of generations in those carefully written letters. In that moment, huddled beneath the rock with rain falling around them, she felt stronger than she ever had before. Her mother's voice, her people's strength, lived on through this piece of paper, and through her. The first rays of sunlight painted the eastern sky in soft pinks and golds as Elias and Rosie made their way back to the cabin. Their mounts plodded along the muddy trail, exhausted from the night's wild chase. Rosie's muscles ached from hours in the saddle, but triumph burned bright in her heart. The deed, still tucked safely against her chest, felt like a shield of hope. Inside the cabin, Elias lit a lamp, while Rosie spread the water-stained document carefully on the rough-hewn table. His weathered fingers traced the legal text, moving slowly across the page as he read each line. The cabin was quiet, except for the gentle crackle of the lamp's flame. "This here's ironclad," Elias said finally, his voice rough with relief. "Your mama was smart. Clearwater Creek and all the land around it belongs to your family, legal and proper." He tapped a particular paragraph. "Railroad can't touch it without your say-so." Rosie leaned closer, trying to make sense of the formal writing. Clearwater Creek, she whispered, remembering how her mother used to speak of the clear, sweet water that flowed year-round, even in the driest summers. The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning quiet. The lamp exploded into fragments, plunging the cabin into shadow. Elias shoved Rosie down behind the table as more shots splintered through the wooden walls. "Come out, Boone!" Deputy Renshaw's voice boomed from outside. "We got you surrounded!" Elias moved like a shadow, pressing the folded deed into Rosie's hands. "Hide it!" he whispered urgently, guiding her toward the back wall. "Whatever happens, don't let them know you have it." Rosie's trembling fingers tucked the document deep into her skirt pocket as heavy boots thundered onto the cabin's porch. The door burst open, crashing against the wall. Deputy Renshaw stood in the doorway, his badge catching the early morning light. 3 armed men crowded behind him, rifles aimed at Elias. "Well, well," Renshaw drawled, twirling his mustache. "Quite the cozy setup you got here." His cold eyes fixed on Rosie. "Time to come home, girl. Your papa's been worried sick." "She ain't going nowhere with you," Elias growled, positioning himself between Rosie and the deputy. Renshaw's smile turned cruel. "That ain't your choice to make, old man." He nodded to his men. "Take him." The first man rushed forward, but Elias met him with a powerful right hook that sent him sprawling. The second man swung his rifle butt, catching Elias in the ribs. Despite the pain, Elias managed to throw him off, but the third man tackled him from behind. "Stop it!" Rosie screamed as the men wrestled Elias to the ground. "Please, you're hurting him." Renshaw grabbed Rosie's arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "Shut your mouth, girl. You're headed for a nice, quiet place where they know how to handle your kind." His voice dripped with false concern. "The railroad's got a fine sanatorium for the feeble-minded. They'll take real good care of you there." Terror froze Rosie's blood. She had heard whispers about the railroad's sanatoriums, places where inconvenient people disappeared, never to be heard from again. She struggled against Renshaw's grip, but he only laughed and held tighter. "Let her be!" Elias roared, fighting to break free. One of the men slammed a rifle butt against the back of his head. Elias crumpled to the cabin floor, blood trickling from beneath his gray hair. "No!" Rosie tried to run to him, but Renshaw yanked her toward the door. "Time to go home and pack your bags," he sneered. "Train leaves tomorrow morning, and you've got a reserved seat." He dragged her outside, where 2 more horses waited. "Mount up, princess. We're taking the scenic route back to town." Rosie cast one last desperate look at the cabin. Through the open door, she could see Elias lying motionless on the floor, the men standing over him with rifles ready. The deed felt heavy in her pocket, a secret burden she now carried alone. Renshaw practically threw her onto one of the waiting horses. As they rode away, Rosie's tears fell freely, but her hand stayed pressed against her pocket, protecting the precious document hidden there. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the trail as they descended toward Granite Gulch, leaving behind the only person who had ever truly protected her. The livery stable's loft smelled of dusty hay and leather, a scent that reminded Rosie of better days when her mother was still alive. Wooden slats creaked beneath her as she shifted position, trying to find comfort on the rough planks. Late afternoon sun filtered through gaps in the wall, casting long shadows across her makeshift prison. Below, she heard the soft shuffling of feet and quiet humming. The stable boy, Jed, moved between the stalls, his worn boots scuffing against packed earth as he worked. He couldn't have been much older than 14, with a mop of unruly brown hair and clothes that hung loose on his thin frame. "You hungry up there?" Jed's voice drifted up, gentle and uncertain. Rosie moved closer to the edge of the loft. "A little," she admitted, though her stomach felt too knotted with worry to want food. "Got some bread and cheese?" he offered. "Mrs. Kincaid brought it by earlier, said it was for you." He paused, glancing toward the stable doors. "Deputy said not to feed you, but, well, he ain't here right now." "Thank you," Rosie said softly. She watched as Jed climbed the ladder, carefully balancing a cloth-wrapped bundle. He settled cross-legged near her, keeping a respectful distance. As he unwrapped the food, he spoke in hushed tones. "Circuit judge is due tomorrow morning. Heard the deputy talking about it with them railroad men." His eyes darted to hers. "They're mighty anxious to get you on that train before he arrives." Rosie's heart quickened. Judge Thorne was known throughout the territory for his fairness, for listening to all sides of a dispute. If she could only reach him. "Here," Jed said, breaking the bread in half. "Better eat while you can." They shared the meal in companionable silence. Rosie studied the boy's face as he ate, noting the wariness in his eyes. The look of someone who'd learned young to stay invisible, to survive by watching and waiting. "Jed," she said carefully, "would you tell me how you came to work here?" He shrugged, brushing crumbs from his shirt. "Pa died in the mine collapse 2 years back. Ma couldn't keep us all fed. Mr. Peterson, he owns the livery. He took me on. Ain't much, but it's honest work." Rosie nodded, understanding the weight of being left behind. She reached into her pocket, fingers brushing past the hidden deed, to touch the silver dollar. The coin that had bought her freedom, however briefly. "I need your help," she said quietly. "Mrs. Kincaid needs to know what's happening. Could you get a message to her?" Jed's expression grew guarded. "Deputy said not to let anyone near you." "I know. And I know it's asking a lot." Rosie withdrew the silver dollar, its surface gleaming dully in the fading light. "This is all I have to offer in return. It's special to me. It's what Mr. Boone used to save me at the auction." Jed stared at the coin, then at Rosie's face. "Why would you give up something that important?" "Because sometimes helping others is more important than holding on to things," Rosie said, echoing words her mother had once spoken. "Will you help me?" Jed's fingers closed around the silver dollar, and his eyes filled with unexpected tears. "Ain't nobody ever trusted me with something valuable before," he whispered. Rosie tore a strip from her petticoat and used a stub of pencil Jed provided to write her message. She explained about the deed, about Elias being hurt, about the railroad's plans to spirit her away before the judge arrived. As darkness settled over Granite Gulch, Jed prepared to leave. "I'll make sure Mrs. Kincaid gets this," he promised, tucking the note securely in his shirt. "You just stay strong, Miss Rosie." Through a gap in the wall, Rosie watched Jed slip away into the gathering night. His shadow merged with the darkness between buildings, moving silent as a cat through the sleeping town. The silver dollar she'd given him represented the moment someone had finally seen her worth. Now she had passed that gift forward, trusting it would light the way to justice. Settling back in the hay, Rosie wrapped her arms around herself, the deed pressed against her ribs, hidden in her corset, her mother's legacy and her only hope. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or ruin, and she had done all she could to tip the scales toward justice. Dawn broke harsh and bright over Granite Gulch, painting the weathered buildings in stark morning light. Deputy Renshaw and 2 railroad men marched Rosie down Main Street, their boots kicking up dust that settled on her skirts. Townsfolk emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the spectacle like moths to flame. Rosie kept her chin up despite her trembling hands. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Walk tall, Mihija. Your worth comes from within." The deed pressed against her ribs, hidden in her corset, each step making her acutely aware of its presence. "Keep moving," Renshaw growled, shoving her toward the Golden Nugget Saloon. Through the grimy windows, she glimpsed Railroad Agent Coyle arranging papers on a table, his satisfied smile visible even at a distance. A commotion at the edge of town drew everyone's attention. A black buggy approached, dust billowing behind its wheels. Circuit Judge Matthew Thorne sat ramrod straight in the driver's seat, his silver hair and black coat marking him as clearly as a crown would mark a king. The townsfolk's whispers grew louder as the judge pulled his horse to a stop near the saloon. "What's all this?" Judge Thorne's voice carried the weight of his office as he stepped down from the buggy. His steel-gray eyes took in the scene: Rosie, the deputy, the gathering crowd. "Just a routine property matter, Your Honor," Agent Coyle called from the saloon doorway, his tone smooth as creek ice. "Nothing requiring the court's attention." Before the judge could respond, movement caught Rosie's eye. Mrs. Kincaid emerged from between buildings, Elias's worn rifle cradled in her arms. Behind her came Peterson, the livery owner, Thomas from the general store, and 3 ranch hands Rosie recognized from the outlying farms. Their faces were grim, determined. "Judge Thorne," Mrs. Kincaid called out, her voice steady. "We've got ourselves a situation that needs your attention." She positioned herself carefully, not quite pointing the rifle but making its presence known. "This here's about water rights and a legal claim being stolen through false papers." The judge's eyebrows rose as he studied Mrs. Kincaid and her small band. "Is that so?" He turned to Rosie. "Young lady, do you have something to say about this matter?" Rosie's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to speak clearly. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." "Now see here," Agent Coyle interrupted, stepping onto the boardwalk. "This girl is simple-minded, legally incompetent, her father's debts." "I believe," Judge Thorne cut in, his voice sharp as a razor, "I was addressing the young lady." He gestured toward the saloon. "Let's all step inside where we can discuss this properly." Deputy Renshaw's grip on Rosie's arm tightened as they entered the saloon's dim interior. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating the legal papers spread across a table like a spider's web. Agent Coyle hurried to arrange chairs, his composure slipping slightly as Mrs. Kincaid and her supporters filed in behind them. "Your Honor," Agent Coyle began again, "we have documents here showing clear title to the water rights in question. The girl's father—" "Has no claim to my mother's land," Rosie interrupted, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "The deed belongs to me through my mother's blood and law." The saloon grew quiet enough to hear the wind whistling through gaps in the walls. Judge Thorne settled into a chair, his weathered hands folded on the table before him. "That's a serious claim, young lady. Do you have proof?" Agent Coyle's smug smile returned. "We have all the necessary papers right here, Your Honor, properly signed and witnessed." He began spreading documents across the table with flourishing gestures. Rosie glanced at Mrs. Kincaid, who gave her a slight nod. The older woman's hands remained steady on Elias's rifle, a silent reminder of the support gathering around Rosie. Even Jed had slipped into the saloon, standing near the back door, his young face set with determination. The morning sun crept higher, sending shafts of light through the windows that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. In that moment, Rosie felt the weight of her mother's teachings, her heritage, and the trust Elias had placed in her. The hidden deed seemed to burn against her skin, a reminder of all that hung in the balance. Judge Thorne's stern gaze swept the room, taking in the railroad agent's confident posture, Mrs. Kincaid's quiet defiance, and Rosie's trembling determination. The very air seemed to thicken with tension as he prepared to begin the proceedings that would determine not just Rosie's fate, but not just Rosie, but the future of Granite Gulch itself. Inside the Golden Nugget Saloon, morning light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across worn floorboards. Rosie stood before the makeshift court, her heart pounding, but her spine straight. Agent Coyle lounged against the bar, arranging papers with theatrical flourish, while Deputy Renshaw hovered nearby, hand resting on his gun belt. "As you can see, Your Honor," Coyle's voice dripped with false courtesy, "these documents clearly show the transfer of all water rights to the railroad company." He spread more papers across the scarred wooden surface. "The girl's father's debts have been properly recorded and witnessed." Judge Thorne adjusted his spectacles, examining each document with methodical care. The crowd pressed closer, their breathing audible in the tense silence. Mrs. Kincaid remained steady, Elias's rifle still cradled in her capable hands. Coyle's confidence grew with each passing moment. He straightened his vest and addressed the room. Clearwater Creek is the lifeblood of this territory, friends. The railroad brings progress, brings civilization. His smile widened. We already control every water source from here to Mesa Junction. This is merely a formality. Rosie felt the weight of the hidden deed against her ribs. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper in her ear, giving her strength. Without warning, she stepped forward. "You're wrong, Mr. Coyle." Her voice rang clear and strong, surprising even herself. "You don't control our water. You never did." Coyle's smile faltered. "Now, girl." But Rosie was already moving. With trembling fingers that grew steadier by the second, she reached into her corset and pulled out the water-stained document. The paper crackled as she unfolded it, years of careful preservation evident in its still legible text. "This is my mother's deed," she declared, stepping forward. The crowd murmured as she raised it high, then brought it down hard on the bar top. The sharp slap echoed through the saloon. The original land grant, signed by territorial governors and witnessed by tribal elders. Judge Thorne leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. "Let me see that, young lady." Deputy Renshaw moved to intercept, but Mrs. Kincaid shifted her stance, the rifle's meaning clear. The deputy froze, scowling. The judge lifted the deed carefully, holding it to the light. His eyes narrowed as he read, his expression growing more serious with each line. The room held its breath. "This deed," Judge Thorne announced, "is authenticated with the territorial seal. It grants full water rights to Clearwater Creek and surrounding lands to Maria Elena Ortiz and her descendants." He looked at Rosie. "Your mother?" "Yes, Your Honor." Rosie's voice was firm. She was Yaqui, and the land was granted in recognition of her people's ancient claims to the water. "Preposterous," Coyle sputtered, his composure cracking. "That document is clearly a forgery." "The seal is genuine," Judge Thorne cut in sharply, "as is the signature of Governor Martinez. I know his hand well." He set the deed down carefully. "This document predates and supersedes any subsequent claims. By law, Miss Rosie May is the rightful heir to Clearwater Creek." A commotion at the saloon's entrance drew all eyes. Elias Boone stood in the doorway, one arm draped over Mrs. Kincaid's shoulder for support. His face was bruised, but his eyes blazed with pride as they met Rosie's. "The law," Elias said, his deep voice carrying despite his injuries, "is what you railroad men claim to respect. Well, there's your law." He nodded toward the deed. "Written plain as day." Deputy Renshaw's hand twitched toward his gun, but Judge Thorne's sharp voice stopped him. "I wouldn't, Deputy. Your badge doesn't give you authority over this court." The crowd's whispers grew louder, and Rosie saw heads nodding. These were people who had lived under the railroad's shadow too long, who had watched their neighbors lose land and water rights to suspicious claims and forged documents. "I hereby declare," Judge Thorne announced, rising to his feet, "that all rights to Clearwater Creek and its surrounding lands are legally vested in Miss Rosie May, as heir to Maria Elena Ortiz. Any contrary claims are null and void." He fixed Coyle with a stern gaze. "The railroad's documents are rejected." The silence that followed was profound. Coyle's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed web of power unraveling before his eyes. Deputy Renshaw backed away from his former patron, already sensing the shift in authority. Elias limped forward, Mrs. Kincaid helping him across the room. He stopped beside Rosie, his solid presence lending her additional strength as she faced down the men who had tried to steal her birthright. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beams. In that light, Rosie stood tall, her mother's deed before her, surrounded by the growing respect of her neighbors. The railroad's power over Granite Gulch had been built on stolen rights and false papers. With one true document and the courage to stand her ground, she had shattered that power for good. Deputy Renshaw's face twisted with rage. He jabbed a finger toward Rosie, his voice rising to a desperate pitch. She ain't fit to hold property. Look at her. Barely able to take care of herself. We got papers proving she needs institutional care. Silence? Judge Thorne's gavel cracked against the bar top like a gunshot. Deputy Renshaw, you will surrender your badge immediately. The judge's stern gaze swept the room. I've heard reports of your intimidation tactics all along my circuit, threatening to commit folks to sanatoriums unless they sell their land. That's a grave abuse of authority. Two ranchers stepped forward, hands resting meaningfully on their gun belts. Renshaw's fingers twitched near his holster, but seeing the hard faces surrounding him, he slowly unpinned his badge and set it on the bar. Judge, Mrs. Kincaid called out, there's more. She gestured to several townspeople who had been hanging back. Tell him what happened to your farms. One by one, they stepped forward. Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith, spoke first. Railroad men forged my signature on sale papers while I was laid up with fever. Sarah Collins, a widow, added, they claimed my late husband had gambling debts, threatened to take my children if I didn't sign over our well rights. More stories poured forth, a flood of long-suppressed grievances. Agent Coyle's face grew paler with each testimony. He began edging toward the door, but found his path blocked by Jed, the stable boy, who stood with shoulders squared. Arrest them both, Judge Thorne ordered. We'll have a full hearing on these matters. He turned to Rosie. Young lady, your mother's wisdom in preserving that deed has exposed a web of corruption. You've done this community a great service. Coyle made a sudden break for the door, shoving Jed aside. He made it 3 steps into the street before running straight into the arms of 2 burly freight handlers. They marched him back inside, none too gently. As Renshaw and Coyle were led away to the jail, cheers erupted in the saloon. Townspeople surrounded Rosie, offering handshakes and words of support. Mrs. Kincaid wrapped her in a motherly hug. Your mama would be so proud, child. Elias stood beside Rosie, his weathered face bright with pride. Reckon you found your strength, girl, he said softly. Rosie straightened to her full height, feeling truly seen for the first time in her life. The deed lay before her on the bar, no longer hidden but displayed with honor, just as she herself now stood, visible, valuable, and victorious. The townsfolk's cheers grew louder, a celebration of justice restored and a community united against corruption. In that moment, Rosie knew she had found not just her voice, but her place in the world. The autumn breeze carried the sound of hammering across Clearwater Creek. Ranchers worked side by side, repairing irrigation channels that had fallen into disrepair under the railroad's grip. Rosie May stood at the water's edge, clipboard in hand, coordinating the restoration efforts with quiet confidence. The Henderson farm needs the water flow by sundown, she called out to the work crew. Their corn won't last another day without it. Elias Boone watched from the shade of an oak tree, noting how naturally leadership had settled on her shoulders. Just weeks ago, she had trembled before cruel townsfolk. Now she directed their efforts with gentle authority, and they listened. Back at the line shack, transformation was underway. Women from across the valley had brought quilts, cooking pots, and spare furniture. What had once been Elias's solitary refuge now hummed with life. 3 orphan children played in the yard, while their aunt, a young widow, helped organize supplies in the newly expanded storage room. Never thought I'd see the day, Mrs. Kincaid remarked, setting down a basket of fresh bread. This place becoming a proper sanctuary. Letters arrived daily, carried by travelers and merchants. A family in Desert Springs wrote of how Rosie's stand against the railroad had inspired them to challenge similar corruption. A minister in Copper Canyon requested her advice on establishing a shelter for displaced families. That evening, as purple shadows crept across the valley, Rosie and Elias sat in their familiar spots by the hearth. The fire's warmth touched their faces as they shared a comfortable silence. "You know something?" Rosie finally spoke, her voice thoughtful. "When Papa put me up for auction, I thought that was all I was worth, $1 silver. She touched the simple chain around her neck, where that same coin now hung. "But it wasn't about the money at all, was it?" Elias shook his head. "Sometimes the smallest mercy opens the widest door." He gestured to the bustling cabin around them. "Look what grew from that one act of decency." Through the window, they could see lanterns being lit at the newly restored farms across the valley. Each light represented a family's hope renewed, a wrong made right, without a single shot fired. "My mother used to say that true strength flows like water," Rosie said softly. "It finds a way around obstacles, brings life where it passes, and gathers force from joining with others." She smiled at the sound of children's laughter drifting in from the yard. "I reckon she was right." Elias nodded, his gruff exterior softened by pride. "You've done more with kindness than any gun could have managed. These folks don't follow you out of fear. They follow because you showed them a better way." The autumn evening painted the sky in soft oranges and purples as lantern light spilled from every window of the expanded line shack. The aroma of fresh bread, roasted venison, and apple pies drifted across the yard where tables had been arranged in a great circle. Dozens of faces, weather-worn ranchers, tribal elders in traditional dress, town merchants, and families from distant homesteads gathered for the community supper. Rosie May stood at the head of the main table, her eyes bright with joy. Gone was the hunched posture and downcast gaze of months past. In their place stood a young woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, her smile reaching everyone around her. "Before we begin," she said, her clear voice carrying across the yard, "I'd like to offer thanks." The crowd fell silent, heads bowing respectfully. "Thanks for this blessed land that shelters us all. Thanks for the water that gives life to our crops and hope to our hearts. And thanks for teaching us that every soul who seeks refuge here is family." "Amen," came the chorus of voices, followed by the cheerful clatter of plates and conversation. Elias Boone leaned against the porch post, watching as Rosie moved among the guests. She made sure the elderly had comfortable seats, that shy children were included in games, and that no plate went empty. When she organized the youngsters into a game of catch the flag, their laughter echoed across the valley like music. 2 Yaqui families had brought traditional dishes to share, and Rosie listened intently as they explained each recipe's significance. Mrs. Kincaid's quilting circle had set up a display of their latest work, blankets destined for new arrivals at the shelter. As twilight deepened into dusk, lanterns cast a warm glow over the gathering. Elias watched a group of children teaching each other songs, town kids and tribal children mixing freely, their small voices rising in harmony. Rosie finally took a moment's rest, settling beside Elias on the porch steps. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the community they'd helped build. "Turns out, girl," Elias said softly, his gruff voice warm with pride, "that $1 was the best deal I ever made." Rosie touched the silver coin that still hung around her neck, now polished smooth by months of wear. Her smile deepened, understanding passing between them without need for words. This gathering was more than a celebration. It was proof that their found family grew stronger with each passing day. The night air carried the sound of shared stories and gentle laughter, a harmony sweeter than any music. Here, where cruelty had once tried to break a young girl's spirit, love and dignity had taken root instead, growing into something far more precious than silver. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.